This presentation will be about scientific socialism. Scientific socialism was a response to the lack of enthusiasm about utopian socialism. Industrialists were simply not taking up the challenge that Robert Owen suggested and creating factories that shared the profits with the working poor. Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto in 1848. That's going to be an important date to remember. He's saying, since industrialists are not giving things up, that the change to a socialist economy will have to be violent. That is specific to communism. It will be a violent change, not voluntary. The name scientific comes from Marx's intensive study of history and the trends in history about who owns what and how society operates, the economy operates in particular. And he observed back to the time of recorded history that the economy basically sorts itself out into a group of people who own things and a group of people who don't own things. That the people who don't own things, the have-nots, ultimately get into a situation that's so bad they can't survive, and then join together and overthrow the haves who have been greedily, taking the profits of whatever it is and living off of them. And then the have-nots become the new haves. Marx was not foolish enough to think that the people who just took over everything would now all of a sudden share it forever. He figured they'd share it for a while, but over the course of time, perhaps in subsequent generations, the people who had become the new haves would end up oppressing a new class of people, and there would be a new class of have-nots, and so the have-nots, again, ultimately would become so desperate that they would overthrow the haves, and so on. So over history, there would be a constant cycle of revolutions where the have-nots overthrew the haves. Now, Marx believed that the political voice rested with the haves. In other words, if you think about the British limited monarchy, the only people who had any vote were the people who owned property and had. And basically, they would always vote in their own interest. So Marx says that in order to make change, it would require the voice of the workers, or what he calls the proletariat. Now, when he talks about a dictatorship of the proletariat, it's very important to recognize that his use of the word dictatorship is not the same as what we think of as a dictatorship being one person like Stalin or Lenin who controlled the Soviet Union's country. Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat was simply a metaphor for the majority controlling the vote. Since the workers were the majority of the population, if you had universal suffrage, and if they were all voting about the same issues, it was very likely that the proletariat or the workers' vote would carry the day. They would outnumber the owners. And so their vote would be a virtual dictatorship, not the kind of dictatorship of one person ruling all. He advocated that workers uniting in their misery would take over the factory to operate it in common. This, of course, worried a lot of industrialists, and since industrialists had the majority voice in their governments, it resulted in a lot of governments reacting to Marx with a lot of fear. This was often called the Red Scare, and we'll see different versions of the Red Scare come up as we go through history after this. Interestingly, although Marx believed, just like the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, that Jesus said, share. He condemned religion not because of the message of sharing, but because of the organized churches that were generally supported by the wealthy industrialists who went to church and contributed the most to the Pope or to the pastors of the Protestant churches, and which in turn counseled the workers who were suffering to wait until they got to heaven for their reward. Marx saw organized religion as simply a front for the wealthy to calm down the poor and encourage them to wait for the reward in heaven rather than to create equality here on earth. And he thought that basically the poor were getting used by the church. So he condemns religion. He says religion is the opiate of the masses. To understand that sentence, you have to understand that an opiate is a kind of drug like heroin that calms people down. When people take an opiate, they go, everything's cool, man. I'll be okay. Don't have to do anything today. I'll put it off to tomorrow. What Marx said is that religion acted like that kind of opiate for the working people, that the promise of heaven, when they went to church on Sunday, the pastor says, the last will be first and the first will be last, getting into heaven. And so the poor worker would walk away from that feeling comforted that though their life was terrible now, they would someday be rewarded. So unfortunately, this led to a schism, a break between the church and Marxism. So the church hated Marx because he was counseling people to not go to church, and Marx hated the church because he thought they were betraying the actual working people. Marxism is going to end up being the root of communist revolutions in the world. Specifically, the first one was in the U.S., in Russia, which became the USSR, and in China, and in Cuba, and there are still some remnants of of socialist economies that were brought about by communist revolution, especially in Cuba. We'll talk about all of those more